Joining us now is Revolution General Counsel Ron Klain. He oversaw the team that implemented President Obama's infrastructure program. Also, Norman Anderson, who's the president and CEO of Washington, D.C.-based consulting firm CGLA Infrastructure. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Norm, we have the details now. Is this off to the races for infrastructure, or is this going to be a long, tough haul?
I think, Becky, it's more like a long, tough haul, right? Because it's the beginning, it's the opening salvo of how we're going to get more private investment into infrastructure projects, how to think about it, how to prioritize. And it's a real question about productivity for the economy. We think there's a huge amount of potential locked up productivity in the economy, and the only way to really address it is through a pretty significant infrastructure build.
Ron, it used to be that it was a pretty bipartisan issue to start talking about infrastructure spending. How did we get to the point where this is going to turn into an absolute battle on both sides of the line?
Well, Becky, I think it is going to be a battle, but I think there could be a happy ending to it. I mean, I think we got here because President Trump promised during the campaign he'd have $1 trillion infrastructure plan. He'd do it in the first 100 days of his presidency. And as you just heard him say in that clip you played at the outset, he put a higher priority on the military buildup, on the tax cuts, and kind of left this for the end. We're out of money, so he proposes to reverse a 30-year commitment to federal leadership on infrastructure and dump it on the states, which are squeezed already, and particularly in the Northeast Corridor, where our gas taxes and our tolls are already high. Telling people we should pay through more gas taxes, more tolls, isn't really going to get the job done.
Although, if we end up doing this squabbling back and forth on both sides, it's going to mean that there is no money that is spent on this, and this problem just gets kicked down the road even further, and the situation becomes worse, right?
Well, I think one of the problems is in the president's budget, he actually proposes to cut as much infrastructure spending from existing programs as this bill would add to it. So, look, I think the good news is I do think people on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans, may well just throw this non-plan out and start and write a plan that is more consistent with the way this has been done in the past, more federal leadership. And I do think that this will be an impetus for folks on the Hill to get going on something else. I think this train isn't leaving the station, but another train very well might.
What do you think that plan would look like?
Look, I think that plan would look like something closer to 50-50, maybe even higher on the federal matching side, a little less tilted to the rural areas. This plan takes 25% of the money, puts it where 14% of Americans are, and a plan that probably would not gut the kinds of programs that the Trump budget does, which is a lot of cuts in mass transit, in Amtrak. I mean, it is a weird plan to say we're going to build up infrastructure, but start by cutting existing infrastructure programs.
Norm, do you think that sounds realistic? Do you think the president's plan sounds realistic? And by the way, how does that match up with how we've done traditionally? Hasn't it been like 80% from the federal government? So even if you get to 50%, you still have the president getting some of his way?
Yeah, in the old days, 1980, it was about 80% federal government, 20% states. But a better way to look at it, I think, is that 86% of our infrastructure is owned by states and municipalities. And so it's not wrong to say that states and municipalities have the problem, have to figure out how to address the problem. You know, I think with trillion-dollar deficits, you've got to figure out how to get private investment in infrastructure projects, and you've got to figure out how to help states make intelligent decisions about shedding assets. A lot of the stuff that they own, they don't necessarily need to own. A lot of the transit facilities, for instance, aren't necessarily state-owned assets. Everyone sees a huge opportunity there, including the riders.
Ron, what do you think about that?
Look, I think, we obviously need more private investment. We have to find ways to incentivize private investment. But in the end, all of us, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, we need infrastructure. It's a common good. It's a public good. This is why we have government in the first place. And I think the idea that the private sector is going to do things, particularly like some of our most urgent needs, crumbling water systems, really desperately needed repairs to existing infrastructure, I just think there's got to be governmental leadership here. This should be one thing, even if you don't believe in big government, that we all benefit from as a public good.
Okay, but if that's the case, if we think the government should be spending all this money, why are you opposed to a gas tax as a way of funding it? We haven't seen the gas tax go up in years and years and years.
Well, look, I think a gas tax certainly is a possibility. I think dumping that on the states as opposed to what other presidents have done, which is use the federal gas tax to leverage some of this, I think really puts the squeeze on states that are already reeling from the repeal, for example, of the SALT deduction in the tax bill. And, it's just an unfortunate choice that Congress made already to juice up the deficit to fund that tax bill and not do something more there, like the Kasich-Delaney plan, for example, that would have taken some of that tax relief and pushed it into infrastructure. We gave away a lot of money last month, but that doesn't mean we don't still need federal leadership now on these critical infrastructure
Ron,
needs.
the Journal points out today that you look at what are called payments for individuals, which encompasses income transfers, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps. This category in 1989 was 47.7% of outlays. So it's going to be 69.2% in 2019. So as a Democrat, you just said, this is the one thing that government should be for, is infrastructure. That's the one thing why did you already blow 70%, not blow it, but, this is the transfer payments, that's sort of something you think of. They don't want this touch, the 70% Democrats at this point. So to say, well, geez, this is what we really need when you've already spent everything on something already. It's not the Republicans that blew it on the tax bill. It's that we're already saddled with 70% of our expenses are on these transfer payments.
Well, Joe, of course, people pay for those transfer payments. People pay out of their paychecks every week for Social Security, for Medicare. So I don't know about Democrats blowing it. I think a lot of hardworking Americans think they're entitled to the benefits that they paid for, Joe. And to say that
the only thing the government really needs, but it's not just infrastructure. What government does, government is in all aspects of our life now, and it's hard to do infrastructure now because so much else is sucking out all of our resources. It's like. Well, it's like
a lot of our resources went into that big tax bill.
If California does single payer, you're not going to have a fire department. I mean, you have to. There are priorities that we need, right? And it seems like to be so resistant against private investment, it's just weird that if it's not federal, you don't even want to do it.
No, I'm a big fan of private infrastructure investment, but there are some things, we all use infrastructure as a public good. There's some things that the private sector is just not going to want to fund. And I think for those things, we need government investment, no question about it.
Well, let me jump in real quick. It really isn't an either-or issue at all. You need smarter government that can monitor the performance of private sector infrastructure investment. Works all over the world. What we've got to do is have this conversation and think about where this country's going in 10, 15, 20 years. Infrastructure can't be a partisan issue. You got to have smarter government that monitors the performance of assets. And the private sector, actually, I think, one of the things that's interesting is the private sector can do a lot of things that the public sector can't do, and they can do it a lot more quickly. And there's a lot of money available to invest in infrastructure. So you got to be smart about it.
Very quickly, Norm, you say you're an optimist. How do you feel the odds are of something getting accomplished on this year?
That's the hard part when you're self-described as an optimist. Look, I actually think that there's going to be, this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, Becky, I think this is the beginning of this conversation that we have to have. Federal government, no more money to invest in infrastructure. You've got to get the private sector involved. If you look at what they said yesterday about Dulles Airport, Dulles Airport's a perfect opportunity for the private sector to run an asset that is underutilized like you've never seen, and to set a model for getting the private sector involved in modernizing airports all across the country. It's about $200 billion worth of investment. All it requires is public sector monitoring, public sector control over the performance of the asset, but you got to bring in the private sector.
You look at the privatization of many of the airports in Europe. Do you think that was a success?
Yeah, I think it was tremendously successful. You go to Heathrow and you have a fantastic experience all around.
Because I would also say that there's a lot of misgivings also, though, among the public about Heathrow and about a number of these airports and other public institutions that have been taking over.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just interested where you land.
I land on airports for sure. Private sector should be totally involved because it's like hospitals as well. Now you get into trouble, but huge amount of technology. Public sector has real trouble on the procurement side. Takes them 3 or 4 years. It's like having an iPhone 5 for your kidney dialysis. Not great. Private sector is much better at investing in technology-heavy industries.
Hey, Ron, just the last question. Do you see any way that Democrats will work on either infrastructure or immigration prior to the midterms with Donald Trump? Do you see them being conciliatory or saying yes to anything between now and November of 2018? That's what makes me pessimistic. I mean, you can't. You can't normalize this guy. If you normalize this guy, he might get. He might actually be seen as a legitimate president someday. So
yeah. Well, I think if he acted normal, that would be the best way to normalize him. But I do think, look, in your eyes, what you see is normal
by
the standards of the other 44 presidents.
I don't want to be normal in terms of Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer sometimes either.
Well, I'm talking about the other 44 presidents. But look, here's the point, though. Here's the point. Here's the point. I think that Democrats on the Hill will work with Republicans on the Hill to build a consensus infrastructure package. I think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see that.
All right. And they'll say yes, and let's work together. I don't know. We haven't seen much of that yet.
Yeah, well, we haven't seen much of it from the White House either. So.
Okay. All right. Ron, Norm, I want to thank you both for being with us today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Becky.
Thanks a lot.
All right. PepsiCo posted